here's the kicker. Hi, Claire. Welcome to Voices in Transformation. Thanks for being here with me. So, you and I haven't spoken in a little bit of time, and we go back. So, tell me what you've been up to lately.
Well, in November, I changed roles and changed companies, and I'm now working for a company called Synchron, which is a Swedish-based software company that has been dedicating its life to solutions in the aftermarket for at least the last 20 years.
I've been working in supply chain a long time, as some of us have been. And when you told me you were working the aftermarket, I've got to admit, I thought, oh, aftermarket. So tell me, for those of us listening, what is this? What is this, and what role does it play within the supply chain?
Obviously, I've worked in supply chain a long time, and I'd never really spoken to many people about spare parts and aftermarket. And I was seeing in my old life more and more conversations coming up about spare parts planning, which then starts to make you think about, well, what is spare parts planning and how is it relevant? And when I started to speak to Synchron, it's much more than just spare parts planning. I think if we think the manufacturing space for supply chain is complex, but if you think about that, an automotive company, for example, has to keep and hold spare parts for every car they've ever made for the last 25 years, you start to realize the complexity of that side of the market. And also, it's more than just inventory and supply chain. It's also about how do you price those spare parts? How do you provide guarantees and warranties? How do you provide the technicians the enablement to come and repair with the part and the component that you send? So there are so many multi-faceted dimensions across a broad ecosystem. I think it was almost like my history coming together. Before Kinaxis, I worked at GT Nexus, and that was really much about how do you connect the ecosystem beyond the four walls of the enterprise. And again, using the automotive analogy, we don't necessarily go to BMW to repair our car. We go to a distributor and a dealer, and Caterpillar or Epiroc or all of these more, I guess, enterprise B2B companies do the same. So that adds an additional layer of complexity and potentially cost and risk into that part of the supply chain that was fascinating to me.
And here's the $1 million question. Why is this such an important thing now? Why'd you get into this now at this stage in your career? And why is this so important for supply chain people today?
Well, I think I initially started talking to Synchron because, being European, I have never worked for a European software company, and I'm incredibly passionate about supporting European software companies. And I think there's so much amazing technology that comes out of Europe that isn't necessarily internationally as known as I would like it to be. So that was the first thing. But secondly, I think, excuse the pun, but I think aftermarket's been a bit of an afterthought. Every company has that needs an aftermarket has one, but and it's usually one of the biggest profit centers inside an organization. But I think it's just been a little overlooked with regards to digital transformation because of its complexity. So that makes the problem a really hard one to solve. And a lot of those historically, the problems, and we've seen this before in supply chain management side, problems have been solved functionally over time. There hasn't necessarily been a single overarching view that looks across the aftermarket that says, okay, how do I start to connect up all of these different disparate data sources to start making much more strategic decisions about what's happening?
And I guess the why now, with the complexity of the world right now and having to build resilient supply chains. I mean, talk me through why is this something that supply chain leaders should be focused on right now, or what's the danger of not doing so?
Well, I mean, we're seeing across the board that it's harder to sell the finished good, whatever that machine equipment is, and therefore finding other ways to make revenue. And there's servitization is I guess the SaaS, like we've done in the software industry, it's also happening in the equipment industry. So rather than buying the capital equipment, you now rent it, or you will pay for it by yield or by by wash or whatever the machine is actually doing. And that changes who's responsible for the repair and maintenance. It goes very much back with the original brand. And I think also it's expensive to buy a new piece of equipment, particularly the large, heavy equipments like a Caterpillar machine. So you want to keep that machine working as long as possible before you have to have another big capex outlay. So having the opportunity to continually repair and maintain that piece of equipment is incredibly important for the end user, but it becomes another source of revenue at a time when it's difficult to drive revenue growth with a finished good.
So going back to complexity, I think it's safe to say that the supply chain leader today or the manufacturing leader today is quite tired, stressed, overwhelmed by so many of the different decisions. Let's talk about opportunities through crisis because we also have seen that. I remember you and I having conversations, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic to talk about what the opportunities were going to be for supply chain leaders through a crisis like that. What are the opportunities of addressing the aftermarket? What's the value?
Well, there is always opportunity in crisis, and we both know that transformation and change, particularly across the complex digital landscape and different teams with different skill sets, is a very hard thing to do. And organizations and people tend to resist change until absolutely necessary. And I think we've reached a point where it's absolutely necessary. And that also then means you're kind of fighting the fire whilst also trying to fix the house in some ways. But the new digital technologies that we have and the experience that I think supply chain leaders have had in the manufacturing space, connecting demand and supply and production planning together, like we've seen, is a great experience to take to the aftermarket to help drive those digital transformation programs. I also think the platform technology has improved, so it's much easier now than maybe it was. The integrations are less complex in that the technology is advanced, and it's making it much easier with data meshes to start to pull these data insights together, and then you can start being a little bit more predictive with the promise of AI and some of its Gen AI capabilities that makes it much less complicated for users who have maybe not needed to be that digitally aware. They can be guided towards how do you make more complex pricing decisions using more complex tools, because you have a better user interface using Gen AI and more of the language models that are out there now.
I like what you say. I mean, sometimes change is thrust upon you and you have no choice, right? And so fortunately the tools are there and available. Now, I guess last question, what should executives do to get themselves ready to address the opportunities here in the aftermarket? I mean, aside from giving you a call, Claire. Uh,
Definitely give me a call. But I would say think outside of the traditional silos. So we see very much the organizations are still, the pricing teams are not talking to the inventory teams. And they don't necessarily understand or are aware of the impact they're having on one another as they're making independent decisions. And there's absolute gold to be had if those pieces of data are connected, but also that the teams are connected. And that goes across the whole value chain of aftermarket. So as a leader, I would be definitely thinking about what synergies we could have and how could we drive more revenue and profitability by connecting up these information data silos to start thinking about the use cases that it would bring. Because as we know, technology on its own should not be seen as a panacea or a silver bullet. And we really have to focus on the use cases that would drive the value and the outcomes that that organization is looking for. And I would start there and then have the technology enable that.
and give you a call.
And give me a call.
Claire, thanks for being here on Voices in Transformation. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Maria. Great to see you again.
Here's the kicker.